The Native Americans and the Europeans had some cooperation that happened, some good interactions, but they also had areas of conflict. So I want to look at those real quick. One area of cooperation was farming. They were happy to show the natives, were happy to show the Europeans new ways to farm. They felt like farming the land was good. That was a good use of the land that they shared. So one of their areas was farming. That was a good thing. Another good thing for both sections, for both the Europeans and the Native Americans, was trade. The Native Americans were able to get things like cloth and tools and weapons that they'd never had before, and the Europeans were able to trade things that they had never had before either, to include some Native American made items and also some raw materials that they didn't have. They shared ideas. The Europeans came over and shared religion, which was a good thing. They shared the French and Spanish and English languages. They shared the concept of paper and books and things like that with the Native Americans, who then in turn shared a respect for the land and as we said, new ideas on how to farm or how to build things. So sharing ideas was another area of cooperation. And finally, we see here areas of cooperation. Sorry, the pictures are kind of overlapping here. Tools and weapons. The Native Americans wanted to have guns. As soon as they saw them, they wanted to have those. They had different metal-made tools that they didn't have access to, or weapons they didn't have access to, that the Europeans brought over, and they were happy to have those and happy to trade for those. And on the same token, the Europeans that came over probably enjoyed the Native American made weapons and tools as well. If they didn't have someone in the early times to make these things, then the use of Native American made tools and weapons would have been very helpful. Now, areas of conflict, ways that we see that they did not get along, were land ownership. The Native Americans didn't believe that anyone owned the land. It was there for anyone to use, but time after time after time, we see the Europeans coming over here and claiming land and saying that it is theirs. And we see them driving the Native Americans off or enslaving them. And that concept of land ownership definitely caused some conflict between the groups. Another thing that we've mentioned is disease. The Native Americans did not have the immune systems that the Europeans had, and they were dying by the thousands from the diseases that were brought over by Europeans. They didn't know how to stay healthy. They didn't know how to guard themselves. They didn't have shots and inoculations like we do now to keep them from having diseases. So they didn't like that, obviously, because it was killing off a lot of their people and they couldn't stop it. And so the big area of conflict was disease. Another one that we see is just a cultural barrier in general. We had very different ways of dressing, very different ways of speaking, very different ways of doing something simple like cooking and eating a meal. On the right, you see a picture of Native Americans preparing a meal. They're very hands-on, open flame. There's not a lot of dishes. There's not a lot of forks and spoons and knives. They're not sitting at a table. But on the left, we see this depiction of the first Thanksgiving, and we see that the Europeans have tables and chairs and plates and cups and pots and pans, and they're dressed differently, and the expectation is that, we're civilized, we're going to sit at a table and eat, whereas the Native Americans were like, it's food, let's eat, it's not a big deal. So just cultural barriers sometimes caused conflict between the two groups. And then also we have the religious differences. On the left, we see a picture of some Native American boys that are engaged in a religious dance. They're celebrating and worshiping one of their gods through a specific dance that they do. They're dressed in feathers and beadwork and clothes, and they move around, whereas we see a lot of the Catholicism, there's the priests in the robes, and they're quiet and they're reverent and they're singing very quietly, and a lot like churches today for a lot of us it's not very active. And so that was very, very different in their religious beliefs, where the Native Americans believed in multiple gods a lot of times. The Europeans believed that there was just one God. And so we all know that religious differences can cause a lot of conflict. So that's a quick rundown of the different conflicts and cooperations that the Native Americans and the Europeans had with one another.